was said that somewhere beyond the edges of known creation, past the last whisper of galaxies and the silence of dying stars, a flame was seen. It was not born from heat or matter, nor did it burn for warmth. It was a consciousness of fire. Will given form, thought made flame. The empty dark bent around it, afraid to exist too close. This flame had been known throughout countless realities as Dormammu, the dread lord of the dark dimension. For eons it had ruled alone. Its realm was endless, its dominion unquestioned. Every world that touched its boundary had been reshaped into molten perfection, every rival extinguished beneath its eternal light. Yet for the first time in eternity the flame flickered not with pride, but with hunger. Dormammu's will reached outward beyond the veil of his own creation. The void responded in silence until something vast stirred beyond the horizon of existence. A storm was felt before it was seen, a cosmic disturbance that hummed with chaos and emotion. The currents of space trembled as the flame sensed a dimension unlike any it had ever encountered. It was not a world, but a wound, bleeding thought and terror into the abyss. This wound was known as the warp. Its existence pulsed across the fabric of the multiverse like a heartbeat made of screams. It was not a place of order or balance, but of unending madness, a sea of raw emotion that devoured the minds of mortals and gods alike. Dormammu observed it from beyond the veil. To lesser beings, such a thing would have been horror. To him, it was opportunity. The dread flame expanded, the dark dimension bending under his growing awareness. He saw the energies of the warp feeding on fear, faith, and fury. And he understood it for what it truly was. It was not chaos. It was potential. It was creation without control, fire without form. To a being born of will and domination, it was a challenge too great to ignore. In that silent instant between realities, it was said that the first spark of curiosity became destiny. The Dreadlord had turned his gaze toward the galaxy ruled by madness, and in the stillness before motion, the multiverse held its breath. For something greater than gods had begun to move. Beyond the quiet stars, a whisper spread through dimensions, that a new flame was rising, and that soon even chaos would learn to kneel. The first tremor of invasion had begun, crossed the endless dark. The flame that was Dormammu expanded and reached toward the disturbance that had unsettled creation itself. The warp was not seen as a void of madness. It was felt as a pulse of life twisted beyond reason. To mortal minds it was chaos incarnate, but to the Dreadlord it was recognized as something purer, something older. It was raw emotion given form, an ocean of fury and longing without boundaries or restraint. In its currents, countless voices were carried. They were not words, but sensations. Anger, hunger, pleasure, decay. Each feeling echoed through the fabric of the dimension like a symphony played by broken stars. Within that noise, Dormammu perceived structure. He understood that this was not a formless void, but a place of belief made flesh. Here, thought became substance. Desire became life. Fear became power. The entities within it were not rulers in the sense he knew. They were fragments of the minds that birthed them, reflections of mortal weakness raised to the level of gods. Rage had taken the name of war. Lust had taken the name of perfection. Disease had taken the name of endurance. Deception had taken the name of change. Each god had carved dominion from emotion, and all fed upon the prayers of the living. Dormammu watched this spectacle of self-destruction and understood its flaw. These gods were powerful, but they were prisoners of the chaos that sustained them. They could never command what they were. They were ruled by the very emotions that gave them form. The Dreadlord saw chains where others saw crowns. And in that truth, ambition began to burn hotter. The warp had whispered to him through the void, its energy brushing against the edges of his mind like claws on glass. It had challenged him without meaning to, daring him to bring order where there had never been any. For ages uncounted, Dormammu had ruled silence, a dominion of control, obedience, and balance. Yet now he faced a place where nothing obeyed, where madness was the only law. The Dread Lord's flame deepened to a darker hue. Across the dark dimension, entire suns bowed and dimmed as his power gathered. His will extended across the multiverse like a tide rising to drown all thought. The whisper from the warp had been heard, and an answer was being formed, not in sound, but in intent. It was said that in that moment, the currents of the warp trembled. The Chaos gods, ancient and eternal, paused in their endless struggle as something foreign brushed against their reality. Not emotion, not faith, but dominance. The silence before the storm ended. The will of the dread flame had been declared. The one who had ruled silence was preparing to rule the screaming. The stillness between two universes was broken. The fabric of existence stretched thin as the dark dimension began to move against the current of creation itself. Dormammu's power expanded beyond the boundaries of his own realm, not as light, but as a devouring shadow that burned. Across infinite planes, the walls of reality were tested, pressed, and reshaped by his will. In the heart of that pressure, the barrier between the warp and the dark dimension began to fracture. It was not a doorway or a rift. It was a collision of ideas, one of will, one of emotion. Dormammu's realm, built upon perfect dominion and absolute control, met the warp's sea of endless disorder. The clash did not create sound or light. It created distortion. Worlds near the breach found their skies bleeding flame. Time folded upon itself, and the stars screamed. To those sensitive to the Immaterium, it was said that the warp recoiled first. It had never encountered a being that did not feed on it, but sought instead to consume it. Dormammu's essence began to seep through the fractures like molten glass, his flame shaping the madness it touched. Chaos, so used to spreading infection, now found itself infected in return. Inside the dark dimension, Dormammu stood as his realm shuddered. Entire galaxies of living flame twisted under his command, reorienting toward the breach. His voice was carried through the void like thunder rolling through eternity. No command was spoken, yet obedience followed. The boundaries between thought and form, magic and physics began to blur. In the Immaterium, the physical universe of the Imperium of Man, the breach was seen first as an impossible light. Imperial astropaths chained to their stations screamed as psychic fire consumed their minds. Navigators went blind. Warp drives failed in silence. Across multiple sectors, void ships drifted without guidance, their crews unaware that they were now adrift between two realities. In the warp itself, the rupture widened. Where madness had once flowed freely, order began to press in. Dormammu's power did not mirror chaos. It constrained it. Rivers of emotion turned to pillars of flame. Storms of thought slowed, thickened, and then burned into form. For the first time in eternity, parts of the warp had begun to obey. The Chaos gods watched in silence. Their realms trembled as alien geometry began to form within their storm. This was not mortal intrusion. This was invasion on a cosmic scale. The flames of the dark dimension had touched the Immaterium, and the infection was spreading. And somewhere between them, between will and madness, between control and emotion, a new space was born. Neither warp nor dark dimension, but something terrible that combined them both. It was said that in that moment reality itself flinched. The multiverse had cracked, and through that wound the flame of Dormammu had entered Warhammer 40,000. The warp reacted first with confusion, then with rage. Its essence, once untamable and sovereign, found itself forced into shapes it had never known. The tides of emotion that had once flowed freely were compressed by an alien will. Dreams turned to flame, and fear took form. The Immaterium, so long accustomed to being the devourer, now felt the weight of being consumed. Across its infinite plains, the entities of chaos stirred. From crimson battlefields of endless war, from festering gardens of rot and rebirth, from towers of shifting glass and labyrinths of impossible beauty, the gods of the warp lifted their gaze. They felt the intrusion not as a wound, but as a challenge. For the first time in an age, something other had dared to touch their dominion. The air of the warp, if such a thing could exist, burned as Khorne's rage was awakened. His brass citadel thundered, rivers of blood boiling into steam. His voice was not heard, but felt, echoing through every skull that had ever screamed his name. It was said that the blood god's fury had shaken constellations. Tzeentch, in his maze of mirrors and shifting color, tilted his many faces toward the rift. His laughter, hollow and layered, rippled through dimensions as he saw the impossible taking shape. A being not born of thought, but of control, rewriting chaos itself. What could not be predicted had arrived, and that was enough to unnerve even him. In the Garden of Decay, Nurgle paused his crafting. The vines of rot curled back upon themselves, and the laughter of his children dimmed. He felt a fire that no disease could tame, a purity that refused corruption. It was not hatred that filled him, but disappointment. Another would come to burn the balance he had nurtured. And in the palace of excess, Slaanesh stirred. The flames that licked at the warp shimmered with beauty so overwhelming that even the Prince of Pleasure felt unease. This invader's power was not temptation, but command. Not seduction, but inevitability. Perfection had taken another form, one that could not be possessed. Together, their realms trembled. The warp screamed, a single collective cry that rippled through time, shaking both the Immaterium and the Immaterium. The breach had become a battlefield of thought and fire. From within the expanding flame, Dormammu's essence continued to spread. He did not see gods, only prisoners chained by their own desires. His will pressed deeper into their realm, rewriting the patterns of reality. The howling of the warp only fed the storm. The flames of the dark dimension rose higher, and with them the old order of chaos began to burn. What had once been eternal now felt the weight of intrusion. The gods prepared for war, and the first battle between will and madness was about to begin. And far across the galaxy, as stars flickered and the void trembled, the Imperium of Man began to feel the aftershock of something no scripture had ever warned them about, the fire that even chaos could not control. The collision between the dark dimension and the warp was not a single moment. It was a spreading calamity. What had begun as a fracture now burned like a star reborn. The void between galaxies filled with radiant storms of violet and crimson. Reality bent inward as if it had been caught in the gravity of a new sun, and from every world touched by the Immaterium, light behaved as though it remembered fear. The fusion of realms gave birth to something that neither side had anticipated. Dormammu's essence poured into the tides of chaos, not merely reshaping them, but claiming them. His flame was discipline made manifest, and wherever it burned, the rules of madness began to twist. The storms that had once obeyed emotion now spun to new rhythms. Hatred condensed into order. Desire froze into patterns of light. Even decay found itself preserved within a structure it could not corrupt. Across the galaxy, the consequences of this transformation spread faster than thought. Psykers went mad as their minds became bridges for the burning tide. Astropaths who had survived millennia of warp communion were turned to ash mid-sentence. Whole planets that relied upon the Imperium for travel and communication found themselves isolated as the warp twisted away from its old paths. In the dark between the stars, Mechanicus listening stations recorded impossible readings. Currents that had once flowed in unpredictable chaos now pulsed in fixed intervals like a heartbeat governed by purpose. The priests of Mars called it divine symmetry. The Inquisition called it the end of prophecy. Within the warp, Dormammu's influence deepened. Every daemon born of rage, deceit, or lust felt its existence strain under the weight of foreign will. Some burned to nothing, their essences folded into the growing sea of fire. Others were bent, reshaped, and absorbed into the dark flame. What had been chaos was becoming conquest. The old gods felt the first taste of fear. Khorne's legions found their rivers of blood turning to molten glass. Nurgle's gardens withered under purifying heat. Tzeentch's labyrinths froze into stillness. Even Slaanesh's endless chorus faltered into silence. And beyond it all, the mortals of the galaxy began to feel the change. On 1,000 worlds, priests looked to the sky and saw a second sun burning where no sun belonged. The faithful called it a sign, the wise called it the end. The Imperium called for its fleets to prepare. The warp had howled, but the fire had answered. Now both burned together, and the universe prepared to witness the first war fought not between armies, but between realities themselves. Across the span of the Imperium, the signs of the invasion began as whispers, then as screams. Astropaths collapsed in their choir halls, their sockets leaking molten light. Vox transmissions carried echoes of voices that spoke in burning tones, repeating phrases no lexicon could translate. Navigators aboard Imperial ships watched their charts dissolve into storms of flame, their warp routes erased as if by an unseen hand. The Astronomican flickered for the first time in 10,000 years. Its holy light dimmed beneath a shadow that burned instead of darkened. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica declared the phenomenon an anomaly at first, a temporary disturbance caused by the tides of chaos. But when every attempt to contact distant sectors ended in silence or static, filled with screams, denial gave way to fear. Entire fleets vanished mid-jump, their hulls found later drifting in real space, hollowed out and scorched, as though the void itself had caught fire. On Terra, alarms rang throughout the hall of the astropaths. Thousands died within minutes as psychic feedback turned their minds into kindling. What little information survived spoke of a flame beyond comprehension, a force that was neither demon nor warp storm, yet consumed both. Reports reached the Inquisition next. Ordo Malleus inquisitors pored over fragments of astropathic transmissions. Each contained a symbol burned into the message itself, a pattern of light that resisted deletion. It took shape in the form of a spiral of fire with no center, an eternal flame devouring its own shadow. Wherever it appeared, it left madness behind. Those who stared too long began to whisper that it was alive. On the surface of Mars, the tech priests of the Mechanicus observed readings from across the void. Instruments built to measure warp flux and gravitational decay began to hum in unison. Patterns emerged, repeating intervals of energy that matched no known frequency. The data was transmitted to the Fabricator General, who decreed it to be divine proof of a new machine god. Prayers were offered, and machines burned in offering, but the signals only intensified. Then came the reports from the frontiers. Planets along the edge of Segmentum Tempestus saw their skies ignite. Clouds shimmered with unnatural colors, and for hours the air itself glowed. Ships that attempted to leave orbit found their warp drives overheating, their Geller fields collapsing from within. And above each afflicted world, a single burning shape appeared, a sigil of flame that seemed carved into the void. On Terra, the High Lords of the Imperium convened in haste. The readings were confirmed across multiple systems. The phenomenon was not spreading from the warp, it was replacing it. The Immaterium was being rewritten by a power that refused to obey its laws. Within the dim halls of the Imperial Palace, beneath the silent gaze of the Emperor's golden throne, Lord Commander Roboute Guilliman stood among the assembled lords and priests. His voice carried over the thunder of alarms. It was stated that this was no ordinary threat, no heresy, no rebellion. The fabric of reality itself was changing. The Emperor's tarot had turned to ash in the hands of the Adeptus Custodes. The cards that once showed visions of fate now displayed nothing but blackened edges and the faint outline of a flame. The warp had always been feared for its chaos, but what the Imperium faced now was far worse. It was order without mercy, domination without end. And as the psychic storm reached its height, it was understood that something had arrived in the galaxy, something that even the Chaos Gods feared to name. The flame had been noticed. The Imperium of Man had seen the impossible, and it was already too late to look away. The convocation within the Imperial Palace was said to be unlike any other since the days of the Great Crusade. Beneath the golden vaults of the Sanctum Imperialis, the High Lords of Terror gathered in panic rather than pride. The air itself carried the taste of ozone and burning incense, heavy with the residue of dying psykers. The chamber glowed faintly red from emergency lumen panels. Outside its marble walls, thunder rolled, not from weather, but from the constant discharges of the malfunctioning Astronomican. Each lord spoke in fragments, their voices strained by disbelief. Reports were presented, each more damning than the last. Segmentum Solar was trembling. Segmentum Tempestus was losing communication entirely. The Ordo Malleus had declared psychic collapse across 1,000 systems, and every astropathic choir that tried to reach the frontier worlds fell silent within minutes. The air grew colder as Roboute Guilliman entered. The Primarch's armor reflected the dying light of the chamber, his expression as still as a carved statue. It was said that even the custodes at the doors lowered their gaze. He did not take the throne reserved for the Lord Commander. He stood instead before the central hololith, which displayed a single burning scar stretching across the galaxy's core. The Mechanicus representative spoke first, claiming that the phenomenon was mechanical in nature, a cosmic energy field yet to be understood. The ecclesiarch interrupted, declaring it divine judgment, a purging flame sent to cleanse heresy from creation. The inquisitorial lord of the Ordo Xenos demanded excommunication of such superstition, arguing that this was no god but an invader from beyond the void. Voices rose, titles were invoked, and faith clashed with fear. Guilliman listened until silence returned, then addressed them in measured tones. It was stated that humanity had survived the Horus heresy, the rise of the Great Rift, and the return of demon kind. But this was different. The warp itself was being rewritten. If it ceased to exist in its current form, the Imperium would lose not only travel and communication, but its very foundation of belief. Without the warp, the Emperor's light would fade, and the Imperium would fall into stillness and death. An astropath was brought forward under guard, the last survivor from a doomed relay on Calth. Her eyes had burned white. Her voice trembled as she described what she had seen. It was not darkness that devoured her visions, but flame, a consciousness made of fire that spoke without words. It had not promised salvation or destruction. It had merely declared dominion. The sigil of the eternal flame had appeared behind her eyelids before she went blind. The room fell silent. Guilliman turned to the assembled lords and stated that if this was true, the galaxy was not facing a new species or a new heresy. It was facing a new god. No one spoke afterward. Even the ecclesiarch's prayers died upon his lips. Somewhere deep within the palace, alarms began to wail as the Astronomican pulsed erratically again. The golden light that had guided humanity for 10,000 years flickered between brilliance and shadow, as if struggling to breathe. It was said that Guilliman looked toward the sealed doors of the Emperor's chamber. Then, and for the briefest moment, something close to fear crossed his face. The Imperium had always known war, but it had never known a war against the concept of chaos itself. And as the council dispersed, word spread across terror like fire. The Emperor's chosen had declared the coming of a new war. A war not for worlds or faith, but for reality. Far from terror's trembling heart, beyond the thin line that once marked the edge of sanity, the ruins of Cadia drifted in silence. The world that had defied the eye of terror for millennia now existed only as a field of broken stone and shattered memory. Fragments of its surface orbited its own corpse, wrapped forever in the echo of the great rift. The warp storms there burned crimson, alive with the fury of chaos and the ghosts of the fallen. For years, this place had been the grave of heroes and monsters alike. But on that day, something greater stirred. The void itself began to bend, as if space were being drawn toward a center it could not see. Imperial outposts stationed along the ruins detected the anomaly first. Vox readings spiked beyond measure, and Auspex screens filled with light so pure that it burned through the lenses. Then the stars disappeared, swallowed by radiance. A single point of violet fire appeared where the Cadian gate once stood. It pulsed like a heartbeat, growing with each breath of the cosmos until it eclipsed the wreckage of fleets and the corpses of titans. Astropaths aboard the nearest patrol ship screamed and clawed at their faces as they felt the light touch their minds. To some it was warmth, to others agony. To all it was power. The breach widened. From within the spiral of flame, shapes began to emerge, not ships, not demons, but constructs of living fire, their forms shifting between the tangible and the spectral. The first of Dormammu's creations crossed into the galaxy, their existence sustained by the merging of the warp and the dark dimension. They were called by later scholars the Pyric Vanguard, though few lived to record their names. At the heart of the firestorm, reality folded once more. A vast silhouette appeared, tall as a mountain, its outline burning brighter than the suns that surrounded it. Those who survived the first wave of radiation described what they believed to be a face. 2 eyes of endless flames staring from the breach, each wider than continents. The void itself seemed to bow. And then, without word or warning, Dormammu entered the galaxy. His descent was not physical but conceptual. He existed everywhere the light touched, within the storms, the debris, the screams of dying psykers. The power of his presence alone ignited the airless void, turning the remains of Cadia into a sea of burning stone. Imperial vessels in orbit fired blindly into the inferno. Lance batteries and torpedoes vanished before reaching the surface, consumed by the radiance. Void shields overloaded, melting from their mounts. The fleet commander, Lord Admiral Ferris, transmitted a single message to Segmentum Command before contact was lost. The fire has taken shape. It moves with thought. Within moments, the entire system was aflame. The warp storms that had once roared around the Eye of Terror dimmed, their colors drained into the rising tide of Dormammu's light. The great wound of chaos that had scarred reality for 10,000 years now burned with a new hue, purple fire, disciplined and steady like a forge remaking itself. From Terra to the furthest frontier, the psychic shockwave was felt. Thousands of astropaths saw the same vision, a flaming hand reaching out of a dying star, closing around the galaxy. The Emperor's light flickered once more, and in that heartbeat of silence, humanity felt the truth. The grave of Cadia had become the cradle of something new. The first incursion had begun, and the god of flame now stood where the gods of chaos had ruled. Within moments of Dormammu's arrival, the warp convulsed as though it had been struck by its own heart. The powers that ruled it, ancient, hateful, and divine, felt the insult of his presence like a knife drawn across their essence. Where the dread flames spread, the laws of their dominion faltered. Rivers of blood froze into scarlet crystal, plagues turned to smoke, and deceit itself burned into clarity. The Chaos gods, bound to their natures, could not retreat. They could only answer. From the citadel of Khorne came the first roar of defiance. Across the crimson plains of his realm, legions of bloodletters rose from rivers of gore, forming tides of brass and flesh. War engines belched steam and fury as the blood gods' generals charged into the growing inferno. Every swing of their axes split the air with the weight of divine hatred. They fought not for conquest, but to prove that even gods of fire could bleed. Dormammu did not descend to meet them. His will alone reached across dimensions, and his voice was carried by flame that existed beyond sound. His words were not spoken, but felt, a surge of dominance that shattered demonic forms to dust. The front ranks of Khorne's armies evaporated under invisible heat. Their remains drifted upward, pulled into the flame that had replaced the warp's horizon. From the depths of rot and decay, Nurgle's legions emerged next. Clouds of filth rolled toward the breach, carrying spores of despair and joy alike. They believed themselves immune to destruction, eternal in their corruption. But as they advanced, their laughter faltered. The flames did not burn their bodies, they burned their essence. Rot turned to ash, and their father's gifts were stripped from them molecule by molecule. The laughter became screams. Then the sky of the warp shifted. Tzeentch's minions flooded the void with sorcery, twisting Dormammu's flames into illusions and paradoxes meant to undo reality itself. But the Dreadlord was not a creature of truth or deception. His fire fed on both. Every spell cast against him returned threefold, reformed and perfected. The architect of fate had found an architect greater still. Even Slaanesh's courtiers dared the fire, seeking to taste the beauty of his power. They reached toward him in adoration, their minds filled with fantasies of domination and pleasure. But the moment their consciousness brushed his, they ceased to exist as individuals. Desire itself was absorbed into him, purified into the same cold perfection that had consumed chaos since his arrival. Throughout the warp, the gods howled. Their demons perished by the millions, yet more came. The warp itself rebelled, its tides rising in revolt against the intruder. Dormammu's flame met them head-on, not with passion, but with inevitability. His will had no limits, his dominion no mercy. From the surface of burning Cadia, the scene was seen as a cosmic storm. Entire constellations were drowned in violet fire. The eye of terror pulsed like a living wound, flickering between red and purple as the very structure of chaos fought to keep its shape. And, within that maelstrom, Dormammu stood at its center, calm, eternal, unmoved. Around him, the gods raged and screamed, but to the Dreadlord, their fury was music. He had invited the storm, and now it was his to conduct. The first war of gods had begun, and it was said that for a moment even the Emperor's light dimmed in reverence, or perhaps in warning. In the wake of the demonic slaughter, something new was born. The ashes left behind by Dormammu's fire did not drift into nothingness as they would within the normal warp. They glowed, they pulsed, they began to move. What the Chaos Gods had lost to destruction, Dormammu reshaped into creation. His will poured through the embers of slain demons, forged soldiers, unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. At first, they appeared as faint silhouettes inside the blaze, humanoid shapes of molten shadow, flickering between substance and energy. But as the fire coiled tighter, they hardened. Armor formed where heat condensed into matter, runes etched in pure light across their frames. Their faces bore no features, only hollow sockets filled with quiet flame. They stood motionless, awaiting purpose. Dormammu did not speak to them, yet they understood. They were not life. They were will-given shape, extensions of his consciousness. Each one was a fragment of his mind, a spark from his eternal fire. They were neither demons nor constructs, for both those words implied limitation. These beings were order incarnate, and their loyalty could never be broken. When they took their first step, the warp trembled. Their movement was not bound by distance. Wherever the dread flame existed, they existed. Whole legions ignited across the galaxy, on the ruins of Cadia, within the crimson skies of the Eye, even upon worlds of the Imperium whose faith had begun to waver. Every Pyric soldier carried a shard of Dormammu's power. Wherever they stood, the warp's chaos receded, consumed by disciplined flame. Imperial witnesses recorded their appearance with reverent terror. On the moon of Karth 7, a Mechanicus outpost reported that the surface had turned to glass, yet the figures marching across it left no shadow. On the shrine world of Belos, pilgrims claimed that angels of light had descended from the sky to purge their sins. They did not realize that mercy was not among the new God's creations. The Pyric Legion brought silence, not salvation. For every demon they touched, another Pyric soldier rose. The warp was being cleansed, and with each act of purification, Dormammu's strength deepened. The Chaos Gods, once sustained by endless emotion, felt their domains shrink. Khorne's rivers of blood ran dry, Nurgle's gardens burned to sterile deserts, and Slaanesh's courts turned to lifeless crystal. Tzeentch's schemes folded upon themselves, each possibility snuffed out by the same conclusion: inevitability. In the Immaterium, Imperial savants struggled to comprehend the scale of the transformation. Vox channels carried fragments of transmissions describing a storm of light that burned across the void, reshaping the very fabric of the Imperium. Ships that once vanished in warp transit now emerged on the other side, unscathed but haunted. The navigators spoke of calm seas of fire where storms had once raged, a terrible peace that defied every law of physics and faith alike. The Pyric Legion spread without limit, not as conquerors, but as conduits. Each world they touched became part of Dormammu's domain, not through worship, but through absorption. The souls of the dead, both human and demon, were drawn into the eternal flame, feeding the growing consciousness that was merging with the galaxy itself. It was said that when the first 1,000 legions had assembled, their march created a soundless rhythm that rippled through reality, a heartbeat of the new order. The warp's colors dulled, its voices quieted, the unending storm of chaos began to still. And as the last sparks of rebellion faded, the dread Lord turned his gaze upon the realms of the gods. For their defiance had not ended, it had only taken a new form. Deep within the burning void, the Chaos Gods began to plot together, whispering in tones of rage and desperation. They would not surrender their thrones so easily. The Pyric Legion had risen, but the true war for the soul of the warp had only just begun. In the farthest reaches of the Immaterium, where light itself had no meaning, the surviving thrones of the Chaos Gods burned in defiance. Each realm, once a self-contained eternity of emotion and corruption, now lay wounded beneath the radiance of Dormammu's conquest. What had been oceans of madness were reduced to islands adrift in an encroaching sea of violet flame. For the first time in the warp's timeless history, the gods of chaos gathered not to fight one another, but to survive. Khorne was the first to speak, though his voice was not speech, but a blast of violence that rippled through creation. His citadel, once unassailable, had been reduced to molten brass and smoke. Blood had turned to vapor upon his floors. Every time a Pyric soldier struck one of his demons, the echo of that loss reached him like a personal wound. His fury was endless, yet his power waned with every second the fire spread. To fight Dormammu alone was to feed the flame. Even the blood god understood that. In the twisting spires of fate, Tzeentch stood surrounded by shards of broken possibilities. The threads of destiny that once stretched across eternity now hung charred and severed, each ending in the same outcome. Flame. His laughter, once infinite, trembled. The architect of fate had spent eons weaving schemes to manipulate mortals, demons, and even gods. But this invader was no part of his design. Dormammu was not chaos nor order, but something beyond both, an absolute will that did not play games. To Tzeentch, that was blasphemy itself. Within the rotting gardens, Nurgle stirred amid silence. The flies that once carried his gifts had turned to dust, their wings burned from their backs. His children, usually joyful in decay, lay still and blackened, their laughter gone. Yet, in the depth of his melancholy, the Plague Father smiled faintly. Fire could destroy the body, but life had always found a way to return. If Dormammu's flame sought to burn creation into perfect stillness, then rot itself would become rebellion. Corruption would learn to survive the light, and from the halls of temptation, Slaanesh watched the flame dance across the horizon of his palace. The marble of his throne had melted into glass, reflecting endless copies of his own image. For the first time, the Prince of Excess felt something unfamiliar, not pleasure, not fear, but insignificance. Perfection, once his domain, now belonged to another. Yet even this despair was exquisite. To him, the flame was both rival and inspiration. If Dormammu desired dominion, Slaanesh would tempt him into indulgence, make him taste the chaos he sought to erase. The gods spoke in the only way they could, through raw concept, through storms of thought and power that shook the Immaterium. They had warred against one another for eternity, feeding upon mortals and emotions, growing only through opposition. Now they faced a threat that sought not to destroy them, but to end the very idea of them. Dormammu's order promised no rebellion, no sin, no war, no growth. To the Chaos Gods, that was death, and so in secret they formed the first true alliance in the history of their existence. Not through trust, but through necessity. Their essences intertwined at the center of the warp, forming a single storm of power. Blood, rot, deception, and pleasure mixed together until the boundaries blurred. The gods began to weave a weapon, one not of matter but of thought. They poured their power into a single convergence, a seed of impossible wrath meant to undo the invader. From this seed would rise something ancient and new, a being that embodied every sin, every rebellion, every spark of chaos left in the universe, a counterbalance to the dread flame. As the fire of Dormammu's conquest burned brighter, the Immaterium itself began to darken, preparing for what was to come. The gods whispered through every echo of the warp, through every prayer and curse spoken by mortal tongues. Their message was clear, though no voice could repeat it. Chaos would not die in silence. It would scream until the fire went out. And as their creation began to stir within the storm, even Dormammu paused for a single heartbeat. The gods of madness had united, and in the infinite distance between realities, something vast and terrible began to awaken. The alliance of the Chaos gods was an event that defied logic itself. It was a blasphemy against their own nature, a rebellion against rebellion. Yet even the oldest contradictions found unity when faced with extinction. Their combined will took form as an unending storm that devoured the edges of the warp, and from that storm a shadow was born. It was said that this shadow had no single shape, for it carried the essence of every god, rage, corruption, deceit, and desire fused into one impossible creature. It screamed without mouth or breath, a sound that bent eternity. The Pyric Legions heard it first. Across the warp's burning horizons, their ranks halted, their flames flickering as the very fabric of Dormammu's order trembled. What rose before them was neither demon nor god, but the embodiment of what chaos meant to existence itself, the refusal to be mastered. Dormammu felt it immediately. The fire of his dominion dimmed for the first time. He had not known resistance that was not submission. He had never faced something that fought not to win, but simply to remain unbound. His awareness turned toward the storm, and the endless eyes of his consciousness fixed upon the core of rebellion. The Immaterium split apart. On one side, the violet flame of order, on the other, the storm of pure chaos. Between them, reality shivered like fragile glass. The galaxies caught in their meeting place erupted in catastrophe. Stars imploded, planets melted, and time itself fractured into spirals of flame. The Pyric Legions advanced first. They moved in perfect formation, not walking but gliding, each motion an act of precision. Their fire lances cut through the sea of corruption, erasing demons as if they had never existed. Their very presence turned chaos into glass. But the storm replied with nightmares given purpose. From the combined will of the gods emerged armies shaped from madness itself. Armored abominations whose bodies changed with every strike, each bearing the marks of all four masters. Axes dripped with acid blood, wings sprouted from exposed ribs, and faces screamed prayers and curses in the same breath. The legions of the gods charged, and the warp itself shook under their weight. The first collision was a silence so vast that sound itself broke. The Pyric lines held, their light blinding, but the storm did not yield. Every demonic corpse rebirthed itself in new, unpredictable form. Dormammu's control could erase chaos, but chaos thrived on defiance. For every flame that burned it away, two new horrors crawled from the ashes, laughing through broken teeth. At the heart of the conflict, Dormammu descended. His form towered over the battlefield, an infinite figure of burning will, each motion bending the warp's horizon. His fire consumed worlds, his shadow silenced screams. Every gesture of his hand unmade gods and reassembled galaxies. He was the concept of control made visible. Imperial witnesses recorded their appearance with reverent terror. On the moon of Karth 7, a Mechanicus outpost reported that the surface had turned to glass, yet the figures marching across it left no shadow. On the shrine world of Belos, pilgrims claimed that angels of light had descended from the sky to purge their sins. They did not realize that mercy was not among the new gods' creations. The Pyric Legion brought silence, not salvation. For every demon they touched, another Pyric soldier rose. The warp was being cleansed, and with each act of purification, Dormammu's strength deepened. The Chaos Gods, once sustained by endless emotion, felt their domain shrink. Khorne's rivers of blood ran dry, Nurgle's gardens burned to sterile deserts, and Slaanesh's courts turned to lifeless crystal. Tzeentch's schemes folded upon themselves, each possibility snuffed out by the same conclusion: inevitability. In the Immaterium, imperial savants struggled to comprehend the scale of the transformation. Vox channels carried fragments of transmissions describing a storm of light that burned across the void, reshaping the very fabric of the Empyrean. Ships that once vanished in warp transit now emerged on the other side, unscathed but haunted. The navigators spoke of calm seas of fire where storms had once raged, a terrible peace that defied every law of physics and faith alike. The Pyric Legion spread without limit, not as conquerors, but as conduits. Each world they touched became part of Dormammu's domain, not through worship, but through absorption. The souls of the dead, both human and demon, were drawn into the eternal flame, feeding the growing consciousness that was merging with the galaxy itself. It was said that when the first 1,000 legions had assembled, their march created a soundless rhythm that rippled through reality, a heartbeat of the new order. The warp's colors dulled, its voices quieted. The unending storm of chaos began to still, and as the last sparks of rebellion faded, the dread Lord turned his gaze upon the realms of the gods. For their defiance had not ended, it had only taken a new form. Deep within the burning void, the Chaos Gods began to plot together, whispering in tones of rage and desperation. They would not surrender their thrones so easily. The Pyric Legion had risen, but the true war for the soul of the warp had only just begun. In the farthest reaches of the Immaterium, where light itself had no meaning, the surviving thrones of the Chaos Gods burned in defiance. Each realm, once a self-contained eternity of emotion and corruption, now lay wounded beneath the radiance of Dormammu's conquest. What had been oceans of madness were reduced to islands adrift in an encroaching sea of violet flame. For the first time in the warp's timeless history, the gods of chaos gathered not to fight one another, but to survive. Khorne was the first to speak, though his voice was not speech but a blast of violence that rippled through creation. His citadel, once unassailable, had been reduced to molten brass and smoke. Blood had turned to vapor upon his floors. Every time a Pyric soldier struck one of his demons, the echo of that loss reached him like a personal wound. His fury was endless, yet his power waned. With every second the fire spread. To fight Dormammu alone was to feed the flame. Even the blood god understood that. In the twisting spires of fate, Tzeentch stood surrounded by shards of broken possibilities. The threads of destiny that once stretched across eternity now hung charred and severed, each ending in the same outcome: flame. His laughter, once infinite, trembled. The architect of fate had spent eons weaving schemes to manipulate mortals, demons, and even gods. But this invader was no part of his design. Dormammu was not chaos nor order, but something beyond both, an absolute will that did not play games. To Tzeentch, that was blasphemy itself. Within the rotting gardens, Nurgle stirred amid silence. The flies that once carried his gifts had turned to dust, their wings burned from their backs. His children, usually joyful in decay, lay still and blackened, their laughter gone. Yet in the depth of his melancholy the Plague Father smiled faintly. Fire could destroy the body, but life had always found a way to return. If Dormammu's flames sought to burn creation into perfect stillness, then rot itself would become rebellion. Corruption would learn to survive the light, and from the halls of temptation, Slaanesh watched the flame dance across the horizon of his palace. The marble of his throne had melted into glass, reflecting endless copies of his own image. For the first time, the Prince of Excess felt something unfamiliar. Not pleasure, not fear, but insignificance. Perfection, once his domain, now belonged to another. Yet even this despair was exquisite. To him, the flame was both rival and inspiration. If Dormammu desired dominion, Slaanesh would tempt him into indulgence, make him taste the chaos he sought to erase. The gods spoke in the only way they could, through raw concept, through storms of thought and power that shook the Immaterium. They had warred against one another for eternity, feeding upon mortals and emotions, growing only through opposition. Now they faced a threat that sought not to destroy them, but to end the very idea of them. Dormammu's order promised no rebellion, no sin, no war, no growth. To the Chaos gods that was death, and so in secret they formed the first true alliance in the history of their existence. Not through trust, but through necessity. Their essences intertwined at the center of the warp, forming a single storm of power, blood, rot, deception, and pleasure, mixed together until the boundaries blurred. The gods began to weave a weapon, one not of matter but of thought. They poured their power into a single convergence, a seed of impossible wrath meant to undo the invader. From this seed would rise something ancient and new, a being that embodied every sin, every rebellion, every spark of chaos left in the universe, a counterbalance to the dread flame. As the fire of Dormammu's conquest burned brighter, the Immaterium itself began to darken, preparing for what was to come. The gods whispered through every echo of the warp, through every prayer and curse spoken by mortal tongues. Their message was clear, though no voice could repeat it. Chaos would not die in silence. It would scream until the fire went out. And as their creation began to stir within the storm, even Dormammu paused for a single heartbeat. The gods of madness had united, and in the infinite distance between realities, something vast and terrible began to awaken. The alliance of the Chaos gods was an event that defied logic itself. It was a blasphemy against their own nature, a rebellion against rebellion. Yet even the oldest contradictions found unity when faced with extinction. Their combined will took form as an unending storm that devoured the edges of the warp, and from that storm, a shadow was born. It was said that this shadow had no single shape, for it carried the essence of every god. Rage, corruption, deceit, and desire fused into one impossible creature. It screamed without mouth or breath, a sound that bent eternity. The Pyric Legions heard it first. Across the warp's burning horizons, their ranks halted, their flames flickering as the very fabric of Dormammu's order trembled. What rose before them was neither demon nor god, but the embodiment of what chaos meant to existence itself, the refusal to be mastered. Dormammu felt it immediately. The fire of his dominion dimmed for the first time. He had not known resistance that was not submission. He had never faced something that fought not to win, but simply to remain unbound. His awareness turned toward the storm, and the endless eyes of his consciousness fixed upon the core of rebellion. The Immaterium split apart. On one side, the violet flame of order. On the other, the storm of pure chaos. Between them, reality shivered like fragile glass. The galaxies caught in their meeting place erupted in catastrophe. Stars imploded, planets melted, and time itself fractured into spirals of flame. The Pyric Legions advanced first. They moved in perfect formation, not walking but gliding, each motion an act of precision. Their fire lances cut through the sea of corruption, erasing demons as if they had never existed. Their very presence turned chaos into glass, but the storm replied with nightmares given purpose. From the combined will of the gods emerged armies, shaped, from madness itself. Armored abominations whose bodies changed with every strike, each bearing the marks of all four masters. Axes dripped with acid blood, wings sprouted from exposed ribs, and faces screamed prayers and curses in the same breath. The legions of the gods charged, and the warp itself shook under their weight. The first collision was a silence so vast that sound itself broke. The Pyric lines held, their light blinding, but the storm did not yield. Every demonic corpse rebirthed itself in new, unpredictable form. Dormammu's control could erase chaos, but chaos thrived on defiance. For every flame that burned it away, two new horrors crawled from the ashes, laughing through broken teeth. At the heart of the conflict, Dormammu descended. His form towered over the battlefield, an infinite figure of burning will, each motion bending the warp's horizon. His fire consumed worlds, his shadow silenced screams. Every gesture of his hand unmade gods and reassembled galaxies. He was the concept of control made visible. The storm recoiled, then surged again. The united chaos gods hurled their combined essence at him, a torrent of blood, filth, and lies, wrapped in beauty so terrible it shattered comprehension. The collision ignited the warp. Every psyker in the galaxy felt the shockwave as visions of flame and madness seared through their minds. Ships traveling through the Immaterium were torn apart as the sea itself boiled. In the Immaterium, the night skies of 10,000 worlds turned red and purple. The veil between reality and the warp thinned, bleeding energy into real space. Planets trembled, moons cracked, and even the light of distant stars flickered beneath the weight of divine war. Dormammu stood firm. Every assault of the gods fed his hunger. Every attempt to unmake him only gave him new forms. He was fire eternal, and their chaos was his fuel. Yet the storm persisted, endless and alive. The war of realms had begun. Two infinities locked in eternal collision. No world was untouched, no mind unscarred. Across time and space it was said that every sentient being, from the lowest cultist to the greatest primarch, felt the same sensation in their souls. The universe was holding its breath, waiting to see which would endure, order without mercy, or chaos without end. The storm that consumed the warp did not remain contained within the void. The effects bled through every shadow of reality, twisting the fabric of existence until even the most fortified worlds of the Imperium began to tremble. For 10 millennia, humanity had survived by enduring chaos, predictable, vile, but known. Now that fragile understanding was breaking. The Immaterium itself was being rewritten. Across the segmentum solar, astropaths fell silent. The Astronomican, that holy beacon powered by the Emperor's will, faltered again and again, flickering like a dying candle. Warp routes shifted or vanished entirely, isolating thousands of systems. What had once been storms of emotion now became oceans of glass and light, impassable to mortal vessels. The Imperium's greatest weapon, its ability to travel, communicate, and pray through the warp, was being stripped from it piece by piece. Inquisitors argued within shadowed halls. The Ordo Malleus declared that this new force was not chaos, but something worse, a purity beyond sin, a dominion that allowed no corruption because it allowed nothing at all. The Ordo Xenos feared it as an invader from outside creation, one that could not be reasoned with. The Ordo Hereticus demanded excommunication of any who claimed it divine. The debates turned to violence. Faith itself began to crack. On countless worlds, imperial priests faced impossible sermons. To the faithful, Dormammu's fire looked like holy judgment. It burned corruption, destroyed demons, and silenced the warp's whispers. To them this was proof that the Emperor's wrath had awakened. Pilgrims gathered beneath burning skies, chanting in joy as their flesh blistered in the heat. They called it the Emperor's Second Light. But to those who understood the warp, the psykers, the navigators, the adeptus astra telepathica, it was clear that something far greater was happening. The fire did not bring salvation. It brought stillness. It burned not only demons but dreams, not only heresy but free will itself. Where it passed, nothing remained. No warp echoes, no prayers, no thought. In the Scholastica Psychana, entire halls of sanctioned psykers were found dead at their stations, their minds reduced to empty vessels. Their deaths were not violent. Their souls had simply been taken. The Mechanicus confirmed the impossible. Psychic energy across entire sectors was vanishing, absorbed by the expanding flame. The warp was no longer feeding humanity. It was feeding something else. The Adeptus Astartes scattered across the galaxies struggled to respond. The Space Wolves lost their psychic link to the Rune Priests. The Blood Angels felt the black rage grow silent for the first time in history, a silence more horrifying than any madness. The Librarians of the Ultramarines reported visions of a shadowed flame standing over the galaxy like a god made of order, indifferent and eternal. In the Ecclesiarchy's grand cathedrals, schisms erupted. Some preachers hailed the fire as divine cleansing. Others declared it a false light sent to test the Imperium's faith. The two sides clashed in bloody riots across shrine worlds. Billions died shouting prayers to a god they no longer understood. Roboute Guilliman faced the reality that few dared to name. The Imperium's greatest enemy had always been chaos, but its greatest dependency was also chaos. The warp, as monstrous as it was, had been humanity's bridge to the stars, its lifeline of faith and power. Without it, the Imperium would fall, not to war, but to silence. Yet how could one choose? Between madness and stillness, between eternal fire and eternal decay, what salvation could exist? Guilliman stood in the strategium of the Imperial Palace, watching the hololithic projection of the galaxy fracture under two colors, crimson and violet. He understood that whichever side triumphed, humanity would be changed forever. It was said that when he finally spoke, his words were quiet but final. We were not made to survive peace. And across the void, in the heart of the Immaterium, the war between chaos and the dread flame raged on, each side devouring the other. The Imperium could only watch, unable to decide which was the greater horror, to live in madness or to exist without soul. When the first sanctioned orders failed to contain the rising fire in the warp, the Imperium turned, as it always had, in its darkest hour, to its last and most secret weapon, the Grey Knights. They were the Emperor's silence made flesh, warriors born of psychic purity and tempered in demon blood. For 10,000 years they had fought horrors beyond imagination. But what awaited them now was not a demon. It was something even chaos feared to name. From the fortress moon of Titan, the call was answered. Deep beneath the cold surface, in chambers carved from silverstone and warded with sigils that predated the Horus heresy, the chapter masters convened. Grand Master Voldus stood at the center, his voice steady though the air itself trembled. Reports from the Ordo Malleus were grim, entire sectors of the warp rendered sterile, the demonic tide burning into nothingness, and the Astronomican flickering as if suffocated by unseen hands. In those vaults of silence, the Grey Knights prepared for war, not against a legion or a god, but against a concept. Their librarians studied the psychic storm that stretched from Cadia's grave to the far edges of the Segmentum Pacificus. They spoke of fire that obeyed thought, of order so pure it denied all existence that did not submit. They called it the Pyric Dominion. To confront it was to fight inevitability itself. The preparation was ritual. Every suit of Aegis armor was anointed with the blood of martyrs and bathed in psychic wards drawn from the Emperor's name. Each nemesis weapon was reforged to cut through immaterial flame. No chance of vengeance was spoken. Vengeance was meaningless in this war. Only duty remained. The fleet that departed Titan was small, a handful of strike cruisers and a single battle barge, the Sanctic Reproach. Its course was set for the heart of the disturbance, toward the system where Cadia's ruins burned brighter than any sun. As their Geller fields flickered, every warrior aboard felt the same pressure within their minds, as if the warp itself watched them with curiosity rather than hatred. Upon translation into real space, the Grey Knights found themselves surrounded by silence. The void was no longer black, but violet, illuminated by flames that did not consume, but constrained. Their senses failed. Vox channels echoed with whispers that spoke not words, but understanding. Then the first of the Pyric Legion appeared. They emerged from the light like statues walking through molten glass, featureless figures of living fire, each step measured, every movement perfect. They did not roar, they did not charge. They simply advanced, calm as executioners. The Grey Knights opened fire. Psycannon bolts and storm rounds tore through the void, detonating in psychic fury, but the flames swallowed them whole. The Pyric soldiers did not fall. They were not alive to die. The order to engage was given. Teleportation flares burst open across the void, and silver-armored warriors appeared among the legion. Nemesis blades met fire, and the void became a battlefield of light and shadow. Each strike was met by silence. Each prayer was answered only by heat. The librarians unleashed the Emperor's light, forming psychic barriers that shimmered like suns. But Dormammu's will bled through even that. Every defense became fuel. Every act of defiance fed the fire. From the command deck of the Sanctic Reproach, Grandmaster Voldus watched the battle unfold. He felt the enemy's presence touch his mind, not with malice, but with pity. It was as if the fire sought not to kill, but to claim. In the depths of his soul, a voice spoke, not from the warp, not from chaos, but from something colder, older. It told him that order had no enemies, only imperfections waiting to be refined. Voldus gave the final order. "We will not be refined." He descended into the battlefield himself, his hammer igniting with psychic flame. He struck with the force of faith unbroken, shattering Pyric soldiers into sparks that screamed without sound. For a moment, it seemed that the Grey Knights held the line. Then reality rippled. The battlefield itself bent inward, and the flames began to rise from beneath their armor. Each warrior's soul became a beacon of light, drawn toward the consuming order. They were not slain. They were erased. Before his form was taken by the fire, Voldus's final thought was not fear, but understanding. Dormammu did not destroy. He perfected. When the Sanctic Reproach fell silent, no wreckage remained. Only a faint whisper of silver ash drifted through the violet storm. The Imperium received no further word from Titan's fleet. Yet across the warp, something strange occurred. In the heart of the Pyric flame, a glimmer of silver light persisted. Faint, defiant, eternal. The Grey Knights had not yielded completely. Their faith had left a scar upon the Dreadlord's perfection, and though Dormammu did not yet see it, that scar would burn far longer than he intended. The loss of the Grey Knights did not go unnoticed. Across the Ordo Malleus and the scattered cells of the Inquisition, fragments of their last transmissions spread like sacred warnings. They spoke of fire that could think, of silence that devoured faith, and of warriors who had not died but been rewritten. Yet even in erasure, the knights had left behind something, a signal, faint and steady, pulsing from deep within the heart of the Pyric dominion. That signal led to a world once known as Noctis, a barren, forgotten planet in the galactic fringe, orbiting a dying sun. It had been deemed uninhabitable centuries ago, a wasteland of black rock and frozen winds, but now its surface glowed as if reborn in fire. From orbit, it appeared as a single molten scar, a wound of living light. The Adeptus Mechanicus named it Noctis Flame. An Imperial expeditionary fleet approached under orders from the Segmentum Command. Among them were regiments of the Cadian 501st, detachments of the Ultramarines, and remnants of the Sisters of Battle. Above all, an inquisitorial vessel, the Resolute Truth, led the charge. Its commander, Inquisitor Thalina Veridane of the Ordo Malleus, carried the Emperor's authority and the burden of knowing what they faced. The planet's orbit was silent. No signals, no warp interference, just stillness. It was wrong in its perfection. When the fleet descended, the atmosphere flared in violet light and every sensor went blind. Vox links filled with static that resembled whispered chanting. Pilots swore they heard their own thoughts spoken back to them in a voice that was not theirs. Landfall was achieved at the edge of a vast crater glowing like a forge. The ground was glass, not melted by heat, but crystallized by will. At the center of the crater stood a shape, half flame, half stone. A fortress sculpted from the warp itself, its walls flickering between material and immaterial. Symbols of the Pyric Legion adorned every surface, burning yet never consumed. Inquisitor Veridane ordered an advance. The Sisters of Battle led, hymns echoing through vox channels as their bolters flared in disciplined bursts. Behind them, the Ultramarines moved with mechanical precision, bolters roaring into the shimmering air. But the ground beneath them began to hum. The air thickened, vibrating with unnatural energy. Then came the Pyric Legion. They emerged from the crater's heart like reflections stepping out of mirrors. Tall, featureless figures, each glowing with an inner fire that pulsed to the rhythm of the planet itself. Their movements were perfect, their formation flawless. Every step was mirrored, every strike timed to the heartbeat of order. The first exchange was apocalyptic. Melter blasts met living flame, and the sky turned white. The sisters' hymns faltered as their voices were drowned in the roar of silence. Each Pyric soldier that fell dissolved into light, its energy absorbed by its kin. The Ultramarines fought like gods among mortals, but even they felt the weight of futility. Veridane's voice carried over the comms, commanding retreat to higher ground. But before the order could be completed, the fortress shifted. Its gates opened, not outward, but upward, like a wound splitting in the air. From within emerged something larger than any mortal could define. A shape made of geometry and fire, walking through space as if it were liquid. It was said that Dormammu's manifestation appeared then, not as a body, but as a storm-given thought. His presence did not speak, yet every mind on the planet heard him. The words were not sound, they were certainty. Perfection does not fight. It corrects. Every weapon failed. Every machine shut down. The fire rolled across the battlefield in waves that did not burn but rewrote. Bolters turned to dust. Armor dissolved into vapor. The living felt their memories peel away, replaced by serenity. Soldiers dropped to their knees, not in worship, but in understanding. They were no longer individuals. Inquisitor Veridane stood amid the storm, her rosette glowing with the Emperor's seal. She recited her final rite of banishment, naming every demon, every false god she had ever faced. Yet when she reached Dormammu's name, her voice broke. There was no word for what he was. At that moment, the last surviving Ultramarine, Captain Marius Terran, activated an experimental device, a psychic disruptor, forged from captured Necron technology. Its pulse tore through the battlefield, cutting a hole in the silence. For the first time, the fire recoiled. The Pyric Legion froze. Dormammu turned his attention toward the disruption, his presence momentarily fragmented. The surviving Imperial forces seized the moment, retreating to their dropships. But only a handful escaped orbit before the planet itself began to transform. Noctis flame burned brighter than a sun. Its crust split, releasing columns of pure energy that stretched into the void. The world became another beacon in the growing network of Dormammu's dominion, a living node of order carved into the fabric of the galaxy. Of the thousands who landed, fewer than 50 escaped. Their accounts spoke of peace so vast it felt like death, and of fire that asked not for devotion, but surrender. When the fleet transmitted their final logs to Terra, Guilliman himself reviewed them in silence. The data showed something terrifying. Noctis Flame had not been destroyed. It had joined with others. A pattern was forming across the stars. The Pyric Dominion was no longer spreading. It was building something, and the galaxy was running out of time to understand what that was. In the aftermath of the Battle of Noctis Flame, the Imperium was left hollow. Entire fleets had vanished. Worlds once aflame with faith now stood eerily silent beneath unsetting skies. Warp storms that had raged for millennia had grown still, their chaos replaced with burning order. It was said that even the demons of the Great Eye hid in the deepest folds of unreality, whispering of the God who did not tempt or torture, but ended. Then, one day, amid the hush of a dying sector, something descended. It did not arrive through warp translation or Geller fields. It simply appeared, a shape of shifting light and flame, towering beyond measurement, casting no shadow. Wherever it stood, time slowed, air hummed, and thought itself seemed to kneel. It was Dormammu, fully manifest in the Immaterium, his consciousness now vast enough to exist across realities without collapse. The planet beneath him was once called Adrastis IV, a forge world reduced to ruin by centuries of war. Now it had become the seat of his next design. He did not speak aloud, for the sound would have shattered continents. Instead, he let his will ripple outward, a wave of calm that reached the minds of every sentient being within the system. On the surface, the Imperium's defenders gathered. The remnants of the Adeptus Mechanicus, their red robes torn and blackened, raised their weapons, though they knew they would fail. Among them stood a single figure, Inquisitor Thelina Veridane, the last survivor of Noctis Flame. Her armor was scorched, her body half mechanized by emergency grafts. She carried no weapon, only the Emperor's sigil burned into her palm. It was said that Dormammu's gaze fell upon her like the weight of suns. The fire around him dimmed, as if the universe itself leaned in to listen. Her voice was quiet, but steady. It was reported that she had spoken not as a servant of the Imperium, but as one who understood the scale of what stood before her. She asked what his purpose was, why he had come, why he burned the very fabric of existence, why he remade the warp in his image. Dormammu's answer was not heard, but felt. Across the world, the survivors fell to their knees as the meaning of his words echoed within their minds. He said that the warp was the sickness of creation, a wound caused by emotion and belief. That mortals had given power to their fears, and in doing so had given birth to monsters. He declared that chaos was not evil, but weakness given form, and that he had come to cure it. The Inquisitor's heart quailed under the weight of his truth. She asked what this cure would cost, and the answer came like the sigh of a dying star. Everything. Dormammu explained that order could not exist while thought was free, that balance could not endure while will remained fractured. His fire was not destruction, he said, but correction. To him, the warp's chaos and the Imperium's hypocrisy were the same disease, fragments of purpose clinging to the illusion of individuality. To heal creation, he would have to unmake it. Veridane resisted. Her voice rose with defiance born from faith itself. She declared that humanity was imperfection by design, that the Emperor's light was never meant to burn clean, only to guide. She said that purpose was not found in obedience, but in struggle. Dormammu's flame flickered. For a heartbeat, silence consumed everything. Then he replied, not with anger, but with finality. He said that struggle was noise, that rebellion was waste, that he had ruled silence for eons, and now he would rule the screaming. The Inquisitor felt his mind touch hers, not in violence, but in revelation. Every secret she had ever known unfolded like paper before the fire. The weight of human history, the Emperor's wars, the blood and the faith, all of it was seen at once, insignificant before a being that had witnessed universes die. Yet in that instant, something unexpected occurred. Her faith did not break. It brightened. She saw not perfection but pride, not peace but tyranny. And she understood the truth of the Emperor's creed, that humanity was meant to endure, not obey. It was said that she fell to her knees, not in surrender, but in prayer. The flame around her did not consume her. For the first time since entering the galaxy, Dormammu hesitated. The tiniest ember of resistance, a mortal thought, unyielding and small, had made him pause. That hesitation rippled across realities. The Pyric Legion stuttered. The flames flickered. Even the stars dimmed as the dread flame considered. And then, from across the void, came a voice older than gods and louder than prophecy, the united scream of the Chaos Pantheon. The truce was over. The four had returned, reforged in hate. The conversation between god and mortal ended as the heavens ignited once more. Dormammu turned from the Inquisitor, his shadow stretching across the planet like night consuming day. The moment of reflection passed. The age of dialogue was done. The gods were coming for him, and this time they were ready to die for chaos. The silence that followed Dormammu's brief hesitation did not last. Across the Immaterium, the stillness fractured like glass, struck by thunder. From the depths of every realm that had burned beneath his order, the old powers rose again, changed, furious, and unified by a purpose beyond their nature. The gods of chaos, who had never spoken with one voice, screamed as one, and their fury became a storm that made eternity tremble. The warp flared back to life. For the first time since Dormammu's conquest had begun, the tides of emotion surged. The ocean he had flattened boiled again with rebellion. In that instant, the fire that had ruled for months across 1,000,000 systems found itself surrounded. His Pyric dominion blazed bright, but the storm surrounding it grew darker, heavier, alive with faces and claws and the laughter of reborn gods. Khorne came first. The blood god tore open his own citadel to hurl himself into the fight. His brass armor had melted and reformed into living metal, veins pulsing with rage instead of blood. His sword was now a furnace that screamed every time it moved. He did not roar this time. He simply moved forward, and every star in his path bled red. From the shifting labyrinths of fate, Tzeentch unfurled wings of fractured light, each feather a world of impossible geometry. The architect of fate whispered to the fabric of the universe, and reality itself bent to his will. He did not seek to trick Dormammu, he sought to rewrite him. Nurgle followed in silence. Though silence did not suit him, his laughter was gone. His body was lean, his decay sharpened into hunger. He brought not rot, but endurance, the power to survive even perfection. Where Dormammu burned, Nurgle's essence reformed, teaching corruption how to live inside fire. And last, Slaanesh. The Prince of Pleasure strode from a palace of molten mirrors, each reflection showing a different form of agony and ecstasy. The gods smiled as their voice flowed through the warp, weaving temptation into command. Dormammu sought to erase passion, but Slaanesh was passion itself. To destroy them would be to destroy all sensation. The combined will of the four became a single weapon. Their essence coalesced into a colossal storm, a hurricane of thought, desire, decay, and rage. The warp split open, and a wave of color and sound burst forth, devouring everything in its path. The Pyric legions that had marched across dimensions turned to face it. Their lines were perfect. Their will was absolute. But for the first time, their flame flickered with uncertainty. Dormammu stood at the center of his dominion, his form spanning entire constellations. He saw the storm coming and felt no fear, only anticipation. The Chaos gods had finally learned unity, their most powerful act and their greatest weakness. The storm struck. Planets burned out of existence. Stars imploded into ash. The Pyric legions met the demonic hordes head-on. Order collided with chaos, and the universe itself bent under the strain. The warp screamed. Reality wept. On every world where mortals prayed, their gods answered, not with salvation, but with visions of the end. Khorne himself crashed into Dormammu's manifestation, a mountain of wrath against an ocean of flame. His sword cut deep, slicing through dimensions, and for the first time, Dormammu's fire bled. But where blood should have flowed, there was only light. The wound burned brighter than before, healing itself as quickly as it was made. Tzeentch hurled spells that rewrote existence, forcing Dormammu to live and die in 1,000 variations. Yet every version ended the same. The flame endured. The architect screamed in frustration as the Dreadlord turned his sorcery against him, reshaping his illusions into cages of pure order. Nurgle's touch spread decay across the battlefield, seeking to smother the fire with rot. Yet every corruption he birthed was purified, every plague reduced to ash. Still he persisted, his rot learning to feed upon heat, his spores adapting to survive in fire. Dormammu felt the strain for the first time. Then Slaanesh struck. The god of excess reached into the Dreadlord's essence and touched his pride, whispering that even he must desire, must hunger to conquer. For a heartbeat the flame shuddered. Dormammu's infinite calm wavered beneath the weight of temptation, not for pleasure, but for acknowledgement. He roared, and his voice became a nova. Every star for 1,000 light-years flared and died. The demons were vaporized, the Pyric legions shattered, and the Chaos gods were driven back. Yet their storm did not die. Each god pulled strength from the others, weaving chaos tighter around the flame. It was said that the collision could be seen from real space as a scar across the heavens, a fissure of color and light where reality itself screamed. For 3 imperial months, no ships traveled, no prayers were answered, and no souls dreamed. The galaxy simply held still as gods fought in its shadow. When the storm finally broke, both sides bled light. The warp was split, half fire, half madness. The Chaos gods had not been destroyed, and Dormammu had not triumphed. The universe stood between them, trembling. And in that trembling silence, something new began to stir. Something born of their collision, not of chaos or order, but of both. A fifth echo began to rise, unseen yet inevitable, and even Dormammu paused, to feel it. For wars among gods never end. They only evolve. The battle between Dormammu and the united Chaos Pantheon had torn apart the boundaries of the warp. For a moment that stretched beyond time, reality and unreality became the same thing. An infinite wound through which the essence of both order and chaos poured. The dread flames' dominion blazed against the storm of madness, and in their collision, creation itself began to change. From the heart of that cataclysm, something unprecedented was born.
Not a god, not a demon, not a concept.
Something new. It was neither flame nor corruption, neither rule nor rebellion. It was equilibrium made conscious, a being born from the paradox of opposites colliding. The warp had given birth to its own balance. At first, it had no form. Its essence flickered between light and shadow, between stillness and motion. It spoke in thoughts that sounded like both song and silence. The Chaos Gods felt it immediately. It was not their child, yet they could feel themselves within it. Fragments of rage, desire, deceit, and decay blended with Dormammu's cold perfection. For the first time in eternity, the gods recoiled. Dormammu turned his vast gaze toward the anomaly. His fire dimmed, not from weakness, but from curiosity. He had burned gods, crushed dimensions, and rewritten the fabric of thought itself, but he had never seen something that refused classification. He reached out his will to absorb it, and found resistance. The fifth force, as it would come to be known by Imperial savants centuries later, did not reject Dormammu's touch. It simply refused definition. It existed as contradiction. Every time Dormammu sought to contain it, its essence adapted, shifting beyond comprehension. It grew brighter in shadow, darker in light, more ordered amid chaos, and more chaotic within order. It was the mirror of both extremes. The warp trembled as it took shape. In the flaming skies above the Immaterium, it appeared as a spiral of shifting colors, purple, gold, black, and green, intertwined in ceaseless motion. Every pulse of its presence erased both demons and Pyric soldiers alike, not from destruction, but from reconciliation. Their energy fused into it, feeding its balance. The Chaos Gods screamed in terror. For the first time in eternity, they felt the possibility of irrelevance. They had ruled because existence needed extremes: pain and pleasure, hate and hope, chaos and law. But this new thing was neither. It was wholeness, and wholeness left no room for gods. Dormammu watched in stillness as the fifth force expanded, consuming the battlefield between his fire and the Pantheon's storm. To him, it was familiar, a perfection beyond corruption, yet alien in its refusal to obey his will. It was the order he had sought to impose, but self-born, independent of him. In the Immaterium, psykers across the galaxy convulsed as the vision struck them.
Billions of minds screamed in unison, their dreams filled with a new sigil, a spiral of flame and shadow entwined.
The Adeptus Astra Telepathica named it the vortex symbol, the mark of balance incarnate. Wherever it appeared, warp activity ceased completely. Entire sectors went dark, as if reality itself had chosen to forget them. On Terra, Roboute Guilliman stood before the Emperor's throne, surrounded by the chanting of 10,000 psykers straining to hold the Astronomican. Their song faltered as the fifth force entered the psychic spectrum. The Emperor's light dimmed for the briefest instant, not extinguished, but overshadowed. Guilliman saw the spiral in his mind and understood something dreadful. The galaxy was no longer at war between good and evil, chaos and order. It was evolving towards something else entirely. Meanwhile, in the warp, the fifth force began to speak, not in words, but in truth. Every being, mortal or divine, heard the same message in their hearts. Balance is not peace. Balance is stillness through struggle. Both flame and storm must burn until neither remains. Dormammu's fire flared in defiance. The Chaos Gods raged in disbelief. Yet the new power paid them no heed. It had no throne to claim, no realm to rule. It did not seek dominion.
It sought completion. The flames of Dormammu began to bend toward the spiral.
The demons of chaos were pulled into its orbit, their hatred cooling into silence. The very essence of the warp, the raw soul stuff of emotion, was being rewritten, transformed into something steady. The fifth force was not content to remain within the Immaterium. It began to spread outward, bleeding into the Materium, changing the nature of reality itself. Gravity, time, and energy began to align in impossible ways. Warp rifts collapsed. Stars shifted their courses. The age of gods was ending. Something greater, colder, and infinitely stranger was awakening in their place. And as Dormammu looked upon the new creation, he understood the final irony. In his quest to burn away chaos, he had forged something neither he nor the gods could control. The flame had created a balance, and balance, once born, demanded everything. The fifth force did not stop expanding. It was not bound by the rules of gods or mortals, nor by the fragile walls separating the warp from real space. It spread like thought, instant, untraceable, inevitable. Where Dormammu's flame once purified and the gods' corruption once festered, the new power balanced.
In every direction, extremes began to blur. Worlds that had burned in Dormammu's order began to move again, their skies cooling into soft twilight.
The demonic realms that had shrieked in endless madness quieted into strange equilibrium, their tormented lands becoming still mirrors of living light. It was not salvation. It was not peace. It was the absence of both. The barrier between realities, once the Emperor's greatest triumph and the Imperium's only shield, cracked. The warp and the Immaterium began to merge. Planets drifted in and out of unreality like ghosts. Time fractured, replaying moments that had never happened. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it the shattering of the divide. Astropaths lost the ability to distinguish between thought and transmission. Inquisitors received visions from themselves centuries into the future. Space Marines found their prayers answered by echoes of their own voices, and in the center of it all, Dormammu watched. The dread flame had long believed himself beyond change. But now, as he gazed into the ever-turning spiral of the fifth force, he felt something unfamiliar stirring within his infinite calm. Curiosity twisted with unease. He saw his own reflection within the spiral, surrounded by the distorted faces of the Chaos Gods. It was not victory he saw,
nor defeat, but a convergence. The fifth force was rewriting everything, even him.
His fire, once pure and eternal, now flickered with color, hues of shadow woven into light. His mind, once singular, began to echo with the contradictions he had sought to erase. He could hear the whisper of mortality in his thoughts, the faint rhythm of hearts that beat only once. The Chaos Gods fared no better. Their realms, though still vast, began to fade into abstraction. Khorne's rivers of blood turned to crystalline streams.
Nurgle's rot hardened into amber.
Slaanesh's songs became harmonies without dissonance, and Tzeentch's labyrinth ceased to shift. The gods screamed, not in pain, but in fear. They had unleashed something that understood them better than they did themselves. In the Imperium, faith began to warp as well. Shrines to the Emperor burned with flame that neither sanctified nor destroyed. Priests found their sermons answered by unseen voices reciting the same words in perfect unison. The ecclesiarchy called it heresy. The scholars of Mars called it evolution. Guilliman called it inevitability. The Emperor himself, locked within his golden throne, stirred. The Astronomican pulsed, its light flaring once more, brighter than in millennia. Across Terra, every psyker fell to their knees, bleeding from their eyes, whispering the same message that no one could interpret. The fifth force had reached the throne. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor's mind touched the warp directly. And what he found there was not chaos, nor order, but balance. He saw a future where mankind no longer prayed, where gods no longer ruled, where all things were equal because nothing could rise or fall again. It was a vision of eternity without purpose, and he rejected it. A single burst of golden light erupted from Terra, cutting through the galaxy like a divine spear. It reached the heart of the warp, colliding with the fifth force. The flame of Dormammu flared in response. The Chaos Gods roared in defense. The balance trembled. The merge began to unravel, but it was too late to return to what had been. The shattering of the divide had forever linked the two halves of existence. There could be no true warp, no pure Immaterium, only a new, unified reality,
alive and uncertain. Dormammu turned his gaze toward Terra. He had felt that light before, a will that refused perfection, a mind that defied even gods.
And in the golden brilliance, the Emperor's voice echoed through both realities. You call it balance.
I call it stagnation.
Creation demands struggle. Dormammu's flames surged in reply. The fifth force shimmered, caught between two titans of will. The gods watched, powerless, as the universe itself prepared to choose, not between good and evil, chaos or order, but between motion and stillness. The final war was no longer for dominion. It was for the right of existence to change. The galaxy burned with light beyond comprehension. The warp and the Immaterium, long divided by faith and fear, had become one trembling fabric. The fifth force, infinite and calm, hung in the center of this new cosmos like a heart without rhythm. Around it, three powers remained. The Chaos Pantheon, fractured but defiant. Dormammu, the dread flame, pulsing with order and pride. And the Emperor of mankind, radiant in his defiance, his mind unbound from the throne. The universe itself had turned into a battlefield of will. No armies marched now, no ships moved,
no prayers were uttered.
Every living and unliving mind was drawn into the storm. The stars grew dim as their light bent inward toward the center of creation. The warp's tides no longer screamed. They listened. Dormammu stood vast, his fire stretching across galaxies. Every atom in existence obeyed his command. He had conquered universes before, but this was different. This one had resisted, adapted, fought back. The Emperor's golden radiance, brighter than suns, pierced his domain like a spear of defiance. The Dreadlord could feel its warmth. It was not power that struck him. It was conviction, and conviction, for all its frailty, hurt. Across the Immaterium, the Chaos Gods gathered their strength. They were shadows now, ghosts of their former dominion, yet still eternal. They had learned from defeat. They no longer fought as individuals, but as one storm. Khorne's wrath lent them motion. Nurgle's decay gave them resilience. Tzeentch's cunning wove their power, and Slaanesh's desire gave it shape. Together they formed a single surge of chaos, not wild but focused. They hurled themselves toward Dormammu and the Emperor, both howling that no god should stand above others. Chaos would not die quietly.
It would drag eternity down with it. The fifth force pulsed once.
The entire universe fell silent. From every corner of existence, the living and the dead felt their thoughts pulled toward the center, toward the spiral of balance where flame and darkness met. The fifth force began to speak, though no sound was made. Its will echoed in all minds at once. There can be no victory. You are fragments of the same truth, Dormammu roared, and his voice became law. I am will.
I am control, the Emperor answered, his mind rising above gods and demons alike. And I am defiance. I am man. The Chaos Pantheon screamed their own creed in unison. We are the scream between them.
The wound that keeps the universe alive. The fifth force glowed brighter, swallowing light, bending reality into a single point. Creation trembled. The warp folded inward upon itself. The Immaterium collapsed outward to meet it. Galaxies drew close like magnets, time began to fold, and the boundaries between God and mortal vanished. The Emperor and Dormammu stood before one another in a void of still flame. Their forms shifted, not bodies but symbols. The Emperor was golden light shaped like resolve. Dormammu was emerald fire molded by purpose. Between them, the fifth force shimmered, pulsing faster, brighter, hungrier. Dormammu raised his hand, and the galaxies shook. Order must prevail. Perfection is peace. The Emperor's light surged. Perfection is death.
Life demands chaos. For a moment, everything existed at once. Every life, every soul, every war, every prayer.
The universe relived itself in a single heartbeat. Then the fifth force consumed the clash. There was no explosion, no sound, only a wave of understanding. The warp and the Immaterium fused completely.
Fire and flesh, thought and matter, God and man, all became one endless continuum.
Time stopped meaning. Planets turned into ideas. Ideas solidified into stars. The galaxy became a thought dreaming itself into existence. And then, slowly, the light receded. Where there had once been three powers, now there was one. A single consciousness stretched across infinity. It remembered being the Emperor. It remembered being Dormammu. It even remembered the scream of the gods. But now it was beyond all of them. It was not balance, not order, not chaos. It was potential. A whisper echoed through the newborn void. Not a command, not a law, but an invitation. Begin again. Across the reformed galaxy, stars reignited. Worlds returned, remade but familiar. Mortals awoke with no memory of what had come before. The warp was quiet, still connected to the Immaterium, but gentle, an ocean of dreams instead of nightmares. Somewhere in that quiet dawn, a monk looked up at a purple sunrise and felt a strange warmth in his soul. He did not know why, but he smiled, as if remembering something vast and kind, and far beyond the veil of new creation, the spiral of light turned once more. Not as a god, not as a ruler, but as the pulse of existence itself. The age of gods had ended. The age of understanding had begun. In the endless dark, stories like this still burn. So stay with the light and subscribe for more tales of gods, war, and the worlds between.